Buttons. I know them, you know them. We've all fiddled with the damn things and cursed at them for not going into their little holes. But did you know that before they came to be the round little plasticky things that we all know and don't really care about today, they used to be a symbol of power, wealth, and prestige.
So, button up and let's dive in to this episode of the history of the button.
So, when we think about the history of fashion, we often focus on grand designs and sweeping silhouettes, but the humble button has been with us for thousands of years.
That's right. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of the earliest buttons appeared in the Indus Valley civilization around 2000 BCE.
Mhm.
These weren't the functional fasteners that we know today, but decorative objects made from seashells. Which is fascinating because they weren't even used for clothing initially, right? To fasten the clothing, right?
Right, exactly. So early buttons were purely ornamental. They were sewn onto garments as decorations, showing that even from the very beginning, their conception, buttons had an aesthetic purpose beyond their practicality. Meanwhile, in ancient Greece and Rome, we start to see buttons that aren't quite similar to what we have today, but they are precursors to what comes next. Around the 4th century BCE, they were made of wood, bone, and precious metals in the form of these cast bronze brooches with intricate designs that were pinned to, shoulder or waist.
Right. I mean, that's similar for the Romans buttons as well, because though they tended to be quite elaborate
Mhm.
for the wealthy, archaeologists have found Roman buttons made of bronze, even gem encrusted gold for that matter. Already we can see how buttons were becoming the markers of status.
That's a great point. See, even in these ancient civilizations, the materials used for buttons reflected wealth. A simple bone button versus a gold one immediately signaled something about the wearer's social position.
Hmm.
But these buttons still weren't being used quite like modern buttons.
Hmm.
Romans and Greeks primarily used them at the shoulders for cloaks or as decorative elements at the belt or the waist. The revolutionary functional button was still to come.
So when did buttons become the functional fasteners that we recognize them today as?
See, that innovation comes with the development of the buttonhole, which historians believed originated in Central Asia and the Middle East,
Hmm.
probably around the 13th century, so the start of the middle period of history. This is really when the button story gets interesting because then they arrive in Europe and they completely transform the design of clothing from then on.
Well, they truly did. Prior to buttonholes, European clothing was largely draped or tied, even sewn at times. Think of loose tunics fastened with belts or brooches. Buttons with buttonholes allowed for fitted clothing and the easier access to it. So, though sewn clothing was also fitted, buttons just made that job easier.
Correct. This created a sort of revolution in fashion. Tailors could create form fitting garments that showcased the human silhouette, and the timing was perfect. It coincided with the rise of the merchant bourgeois class in Europe with the beginning of the Renaissance. Society was changing, wealth was spreading beyond just the nobility, and fashion became an important way to display one's status to society.
Right. I mean, buttons exploded in popularity during 13th and the 14th century. Records show that some garments from this period had dozens, even hundreds of buttons. By the 14th century, we have accounts of clothing with up to 150 buttons, running from the neck to the hem, yes, and along the sleeves as well. And this wasn't just for practicality.
No, not at all. This is where buttons really became status symbols because having that many buttons was a clear display of wealth for several reasons. First, the buttons themselves were expensive, especially if they were made from precious materials. Second, all those buttons required significantly more labor from tailors, making the garments themselves more costly.
Right.
And third, clothing with many small buttons required assistants to put on and take off, so that means the wearer can afford a number of
So
servants.
that's right. It's fascinating how buttons started as a symbol of social standing.
Mhm.
The late medieval period and Renaissance saw buttons reach new heights of extravagance. For wealthy, the buttons became tiny canvases for displaying wealth and taste.
Exactly. These aristocracy and wealthy merchants wore buttons made of silver, gold, ivory, and precious gems. Some buttons from this period are works of art. They feature intricate engravings, miniature paintings, or elaborate filigree work. The trend continued for centuries, and by the 18th century, men's waistcoats became showcases for ornate button displays. A single set of fancy buttons for a waistcoat could cost more than a laborer's annual wages.
My God, that is quite a lot. But this is quite incredible to think about, no? Ki there are accounts of aristocrats commissioning buttons with miniature portraits. There are pastoral scenes and even covered in diamonds. Doesn't love diamonds.
Amazing.
The French court under Louis XIV and Louis XV was particularly notorious for button extravagance.
Mhm.
Courtiers would constantly try to outdo each other with more elaborate and expensive buttons.
And it wasn't just vanity, it was politics. In that setting, displaying your wealth through fashion was a way of maintaining your social standing and demonstrating loyalty to the crown. The button industry had become so significant that it affected international trade and politics. Button makers had formed powerful guilds, and some regions even became famous for button craftsmanship.
Right. Anita, you were also telling me about the what was the costliest somebody had spent the amount on buttons.
We will get to this later, but the most I think a king, this is Henry VIII, ever spent on buttons throughout his entire reign was the modern equivalent of 5 million pounds sterling. Think about that for a second.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that is true. And in fact, button manufacturing became so profitable during the time that countries passed laws to protect their domestic button industries. So, for example, in 1721, Britain passed the legislation prohibiting the import of foreign buttons to protect the button making industry.
Right. And there were also sumptuary laws which would sometimes specifically mention buttons, restricting who could wear certain types based on social class. These laws literally codified buttons as class markers.
And since we have mentioned sumptuary laws, we should move on to what exactly those are and why they matter. See, sumptuary laws were easily reversible, temporary laws that were initially meant to prevent people from excessive personal expenditure under the guise of stopping extravagance or luxury. They've existed in one form or the other ever since ancient Greek, and they mainly govern dress, food, or trade.
Right. But because these laws were always so focused on small things like that, they were very difficult, even impossible, to actually enforce over long periods of time.
Hmm.
Things like how many guests are you allowed to have over, or how many times a day you could eat a meal of flesh and fish, or even the kind of dyes that you can wear.
Yeah.
Today, we're mostly just focusing on the sumptuary laws from the Middle Ages in England and Italy. These were used as ways to differentiate social status amongst aristocrats between the nobility and the common people. Some laws would restrict the wearing of certain fabrics or colors based on the worth of the totality of land that one owned.
Okay. Oh, so in effect, sumptuary laws tended to exist just so the upper classes could better distinguish themselves from the lower
Mhm.
classes. This became especially more pronounced when the bourgeois merchant class became gaining the same wealth as the aristocracy. Rich commoners and nobles were still seen as entirely different social classes. But with similar levels of wealth, they wanted a way to be able to tell the difference at a glance, of course. Moreover, these laws disproportionately affected women, with noble women being subjected to far more restrictions than noble men. That's because sumptuary laws was just often tied to morality and religion as justification.
Right. And since we have covered a bit about sumptuary laws themselves, we can move back to buttons and how they were dealt with in sumptuary law. First, medieval England. See, ever since the invention of the buttonhole, and I'm talking about the slit, not the holes in the button itself, those come later, buttons exploded. Everyone wants them. Noblemen would attempt to outbutton each other's outfits with gold buttons just to prove how wealthy they were. King Francis of France, once I remember this, commissioned an outfit to have 13,600 gold buttons so he could outdo King Henry VIII of England, who had the same idea and showed up to that meeting with the same amount of buttons. Golden.
I guess.
The button industry was booming. Gold, gems, opal, seashells. If there was a way to show off your buttons, people would take it.
Absolutely. And that's where the sumptuary laws come in. People were a little too button happy, as they'd like to say, and that was definitely extravagant. So the royal courts decided to limit the expenditure on buttons. If you were the level of yeoman, handicraftsman, or below, in England at least, you were banned from wearing any buttons altogether.
Mhm.
Anywhere between that and nobility, You could wear a few buttons made of wood and bone, but only up to the sleeve. Yeah. For the wealthy, you could wear certain amount of buttons based on the aggregate income of all of your lands. In a feudal system, it's easy to imagine who that could possibly include.
Hmm. And while the laws in England were about expenditure and extravagance, the laws in Italy, specifically Florence, were all about morality. In particular, the morality of women. Classic. Florentine women were heavily monitored, noble or not, for their moral purity, and buttons were called out in particular. Here is a text of the sumptuary law from 1356 that reads: no woman or female or girl should dare to use in the city of Florence, at home or outside the home, any type of button, enameled or glazed, to any garment on which there is any decoration with pearls or precious stones. Now, obviously, the women didn't like that very much. In fact, they rebelled so much against the law that it even came out to be reflected in satirical plays written at the time. Women would go out in their finest buttons, decked to the nines in buttons, and when approached by some man about their immorality, would act offended and point out that they were wearing beads, no hanks or buttonholes in sight.
Of course. When European colonists arrived in America, they brought their button traditions with them.
Hmm.
But something interesting happened. Buttons took on a new significance in the colonial society.
Absolutely. In the American colonies, fancy buttons became particularly important status symbols. Colonial elites were eager to prove that they weren't provincial, quote unquote, and could keep up with European fashions. Importing buttons from England or France was a way to demonstrate cosmopolitan taste.
Right. And there was a practical element in it too. In a society where traditional European status markers like ancient family estates weren't available, portable wealth and fashion became more important for establishing social position.
Exactly. Plus, buttons had tremendous trade value. There are fascinating accounts of early colonialists using buttons as trade items with the indigenous peoples. And some buttons have been found in archaeological sites far from European settlements.
This period also saw the rise of a peculiar and poignant button tradition, the mourning button.
Ah, of course. Uh, that's the
Yeah.
Yes.
Uh,
Mourning buttons emerged as a part of elaborate Victorian death rituals. When someone died, specifically someone of high social standing, custom buttons would be commissioned to commemorate them.
These buttons were often covered in black fabric
Mhm.
and made from jet, that is a black fossilized wood sort of thing, or featured miniature mourning scenes. Some even contained locks of the deceased hair under the glass.
What I find most touching about these buttons is that they were worn by family members during the mourning period, which could last up to 2 years for a widow, and they were deeply personal memorials carried on your clothing.
It's a beautiful example of how buttons serve not just a practical or status, not just practical or status functions, but emotional and memorial purposes as well. But this era of personalized handicraft button was about to face a dramatic transformation.
Hmm. The industrial revolution of the late 18th and 19th centuries transformed nearly every aspect of button manufacturing, and buttons were well, it's button manufacturing.
Yes, so one of the most significant innovations was the steel cut button, which first appeared in the late 18th century.
Right, France again.
Unlike in France.
Mhm.
Okay, and unlike handicrafted buttons, these could be stamped out by machines in large quantities.
Birmingham, England became the center of metal button manufacturing by the 1800s, and factories were producing millions of buttons annually, employing new steam powered machinery to cut, stamp, and polish metal buttons.
And the timing is perfect. The rise of military uniforms and standardized work clothing created massive demands for identical and durable buttons.
Exactly. The Napoleonic Wars alone required millions of uniform buttons. A single soldier's uniform might have dozens of buttons, all needing to be identical and produced to military specification.
This marked a fundamental shift in button philosophy, from the button as an individual art object to the button as standardized an interchangeable part.
Right. And while this made buttons affordable and accessible to common people, something was lost in the process.
Right.
The intricate craftsmanship that we discussed just now, those miniature paintings, the final metalwork, and the individual character of each button began to disappear.
Yeah. when an art becomes a commodity sort of
Right.
thing. Yeah. It's interesting that even in this industrialized context, though, there were still attempts to maintain some artistic elements. Standard metal buttons often featured intricate designs, regimental insignia, or commemorative images.
True, but these were mass produced designs rather than individually crafted pieces. And as industrialization advanced, even these started to become simpler and more standardized.
Right. And the real revolution in button manufacturing came in the early 20th century with the development of plastic.
Ugh, the first plastic buttons were made from materials like celluloid.
Yeah.
That was invented in the 1860s, but they became commercially viable later. By the 1930s, new plastics like Bakelite revolutionized button production.
Plastic buttons could be produced in any color, any shape, at the fraction of the cost of traditional materials. Of course, they cut the cost. When injection modeling,
Hmm.
my bad, was perfected, buttons could be manufactured by thousands with minimal human intervention.
And this really made buttons democratic and boring, affordable for everyone. It also accelerated the decline of button craftsmanship. Why spend weeks crafting a single set of buttons when a machine can spit out like a million a day?
Same problem everywhere. World War II further cemented plastic's dominance in button manufacturing. Metal was needed for the war effort, so
Hmm.
civilian clothing shifted almost entirely to plastic buttons.
And after the war, as ready to wear clothing became the norm and mass produced plastic buttons became standard, by 1950, most people's clothing featured simple, utilitarian plastic buttons that were designed to be functional and entirely unobtrusive instead of, pretty.
And decorative. Yeah, that's true. And it's worth nothing that this shift wasn't just about manufacturing technology, but also about changing fashion ideologies. Modernism emphasized clean lines and functionality over ornamentation. In this context, elaborate buttons could seem fussy or old fashioned, as they'd like to call it.
Exactly.
Mm.
But the button's journey from a status symbol to just functional and boring, I will say again, parallels broader shifts in how we think about design and consumption in a capitalist society.
Yeah, I think there's something genuinely sad about the disappearance of the personalized crafted button. I mean, these weren't just fasteners; they were expressions of individuality, craftsmanship, even personal history.
I agree. When I look at museum collections of historical buttons, I am struck by how much personality these tiny little things contain. You can see the hand of the maker and the taste of the wearer and the values of the society that produced them.
And there's an intimacy to buttons that make this loss particularly poignant. They weren't close to the body, handled daily, and often passed down through generations.
Exactly.
A great grandmother's silver buttons might contain stories and memories that mass produce practical ones
Just don't.
they can't.
What I find most troubling is how this shift represents a broader move towards disposability.
Hmm.
Historical buttons were made to last for generations. They were repaired, reused, and treasured, sometimes as family heirlooms. They Today's buttons, though, entirely disposable. You lose them and no one cares. I've lost 5 buttons this week alone.
My God, actually?
Yes.
I mean, that's so true now. Think about how many plastic buttons end up in landfills, while antique buttons are still being collected and preserved centuries after they were made.
There's also a loss of local distinctiveness. Traditional button making varied by region. Materials, designs reflected local resources and aesthetic tradition. Mass production just homogenized them. It's like the McDonaldization of your clothing.
And with that, we've also lost the social ritual of button making, of
Mhm.
course. In many communities, creating decorative buttons was a social activity where skills were passed down and stories were shared. It connected generations in a way that purchasing mass produced buttons or plastic ones at that just
Just
don't.
don't.
Yeah.
I do see some hope though.
Hmm.
The maker movement and renewed interest in traditional crafts has revived some interest in artisanal buttons. Small batch producers are creating buttons from natural elements like wood, shell, and ceramics. Once
Yeah,
again.
even see those bamboo buttons nowadays on
Mm.
t-shirts. Yeah. And vintage button collecting has become quite popular.
I wish I could collect them myself.
Yes. People are rediscovering the beauty and history of these tiny artifacts, even if they're not wearing them every day.
Right. Though I think there is something bittersweet about buttons becoming collector's items instead of everyday objects. It suggests that we still value the craftsmanship, but have relegated it to a rather expensive luxury hobby rather than just a part of your daily life.
Right.
On that note, to end this on a high note, let's go over some fun button types, past and present.
Let's begin with the past one.
Okay, I have fewer. So, first, did you know that in about the 1830s, smugglers were known for wearing things called box buttons, which were little cube shaped buttons that they would wear over here that opened up to little secret compartments that they put drugs in to smuggle across borders. Second, habitat buttons. Habitat buttons were for the nature enjoyers amongst us in the Victorian era. These buttons were used to have those little blobs of amber that had preserved insects in them, or dried plants, or any moss or lichen that the wearer found interesting. Mostly found amongst the more studious types. Then there were the lovers buttons. Lovers buttons are buttons worn between two lovers, again in the Victorian time period, because they could not just tell each other that they loved each other. There were laws around that.
A button form of PDA.
Yeah, button PDA
Yeah.
is when they would, again, a glass button that opened up like a little locket, and they'd put a lock of their lover's hair into the button and close it and just wear that forever. Then there were crest buttons, wherein if you were an aristocrat, then your cast bronze buttons would feature your family crest. These were worn to official functions. And finally, the World War compass buttons, where during the World War, the Allied forces would have little buttons that would pop open, and there would be a compass inside in case their pilots got grounded while flying.
Right.
Back to the present.
Now to the present, as she said. So basically, these are the ones we already know because they're quite popular nowadays, but still very, very pretty. So the first ones are the toggle buttons. So these buttons have like they are paired with loops. So they
Mm.
create like a distinctive look on coats and high-end outwear when you want to look fancy. You know, those sort of things. You should on belts as well. I've seen them. Now, the next one are novelty buttons. So, novelty buttons are basically the kind of buttons that are shaped like different things. So, some buttons are shaped like animals, some
Strawberries.
buttons, strawberries, ice cream, so many things.
Now I'm hungry.
They're very colorful, so they look extremely pretty.
Mhm.
Yeah. Then the next one is it's called the check glass button. So they were intricately press designed, and they came around the early 20th century period, and they're still made today. And they are like particularly when they catch the light, so any sort of light, they just shine brightly because they're made of glass and they reflect the light.
I have to
So
say
the thing
that.
is, while I was searching for it, there's this one particular button I saw which was like a peacock shape, like they had filled it with the peacock picture, glass painted, and it was so beautiful, but it was extremely expensive all of
Yeah, I can imagine.
yeah. But yeah, so there you have the check glass buttons. Then we have the traditional toggles that are made from horn, bone, usually slow fashioned, old, vintagey look sort of a thing.
Sustainability.
Yes. Then comes there also, yeah, is the mismatched button set. So basically, in a single look or a single wear, you have a different colored types, different shape types. So it sort of gives you a gallery look. That's what they call
Eccentric.
it. Yeah, eccentric, exactly. And then we have, oh, this one was quite popular on the net. It was the glow in the dark button.
Yeah, glow in the dark is big for kids.
Yeah, I know. Like they wear it and they go in the dark with the UV light on, and the buttons are just the shirt is completely white. The
Can
buttons
you
are
imagine walking into a room and there's somebody who just like dot 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 dot.
yeah, that's true. I mean, weirdly creepy but fun.
Mhm.
Yeah, and then yeah, this was my favorite one. So I found these buttons. It's quite intriguing how they. So it's quite artistic in the sense that what they do is the buttonholes are painted in the form of an eye. So
Mhm.
it has the eyelashes, everything, and the buttons are in the form of irises. So you have blue, you have green, you have brown, black, all of that. And when you put it, it looks like a complete eye in front of your shirt.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so those were the present ones.
Well, That was a shockingly classist and mildly sexist history of the button. We hope you enjoyed. This was the end of our episode. I am Anvita Prasad.
I'm
This is
Manasara, and but
bye.
keep buttoning up. Yeah.